Welcome all to the 10th episode in a series of webinars showcasing the use cases and benefits of Copernicus, the Earth observation component of the EU Space Program. My name is Sofia Otero Uomono, and I'm part of the Copernicus Support Office. I'll be your moderator today, and this 10th webinar looks at how Copernicus data can be an asset for carbon and ecosystem accounting. I should mention that this webinar is being recorded and that it will be shared on the Copernicus YouTube channel. To make the webinar a bit more interactive, we will be using Slido for live questions. If you have downloaded WebEx, you will find Slido to the right-hand side of your screen in the Apps tab. If you're joining us directly from your browser, you can access Slido using the link shared in the chat. You may respond to the questions that pop up on Slido as we go, and also you may ask questions based on the content presented today. So please feel free to type in your questions so that we may answer them during the Q&A sessions after each of the presentations. As an initial icebreaker, we would like to ask you, how would you rate your knowledge about Copernicus? To start, let's go very briefly through the agenda. We'll have two presentations from experts in the field today. We have Richard Engelen from the Copernicus Atmosphere Monitoring Service and Marc Pattinson from the consultancy group G.A.C. group. Following each of the presentations, we will open the floor to you, the audience, to ask any questions that you may have. So please feel free to type in your questions on Slido. Now, our first speaker today is Richard Engelen. Dr. Engelen is Deputy Director of the Copernicus Atmosphere Monitoring Service, CAMS, at ECMWF. He also leads the CAMS development section in the Copernicus department. Richard has a scientific background in satellite remote sensing and data simulation of atmospheric composition. He has more than 20 years of experience in developing and operating operational forecast services for atmospheric composition and air quality. Richard is and has been a member of various satellite mission advisory groups, national and international review panels, and expert panels advising the European Commission. Richard, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for this nice introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here today to present a little bit about how we use the Copernicus program to actually monitor carbon emissions as part of this webinar, and especially about the new tools we are developing in support of European Union green policies. So let me start by introducing you to why we are actually doing this. Why are we interested in monitoring or even accounting of carbon emissions? Well, as hopefully every one of you knows, we've set ourselves as a global community goals to limit the increase of global temperatures due to climate change. So these are limits we needed to set to reduce the impact of climate change on our daily lives. We all know what's at stake. And in order to do so, we need to actually change our emissions of greenhouse gases. Atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases have been increasing over the years, leading to this temperature increase. And in order to reduce these atmospheric concentrations to pre-industrial levels, we need to drastically decrease or completely remove our emissions of these greenhouse gases. There's different mitigation activities already going on. There's different scenarios that you can see in this nice graph, from current practice to very optimistic scenarios. And we need a way to make sure we stay on track to these scenarios. So we need a way to monitor our actions. And that's why we are trying to see, well, what can we do to accurately monitor the emissions and especially the mitigation actions to reduce these emissions. So within Copernicus, which has been existing for quite some time now, the EU Earth Observation Program, we combine the development and launch of new satellites observing the Earth environment, atmosphere, but also land, ocean, and emergency and security. And we combine that with a service component where we translate these observations in actually policy relevant information, for instance, or information that's of use to companies and the general public. So there's different services that are already existing. I will be mostly talking about the atmosphere monitoring service, because this is where we are implementing these new capabilities to monitor our greenhouse gas emissions. So why is this important, and why is this relevant to be funded by the European Commission? Well, the European Commission is very ambitious in making sure we continue to move to a better world, to a better environment. And there's different initiatives: the European Climate Law, the land use change and forestry regulation, the EU methane strategy, and also the EU biodiversity strategy. So these are all ambitious programs where we try together within the European Union to make sure we improve our environment. And Copernicus is seen as a good framework to use observations by satellites and by ground-based sensors combined with the service component to support these different initiatives to make sure we stay on track. When we talk about the carbon cycle, it's actually quite complex what we need to monitor, what we want to monitor. We are, of course, interested in the impact of human action on the atmospheric greenhouse gas concentrations. So, for instance, fossil fuel emissions of CO2, leakages of methane, but these are embedded in a much more complicated, what we call carbon cycle. You can see in these two different plots that there's different fluxes going between the land and the ocean and the atmosphere based on different ecosystems on different areas of the world that all contribute to the atmospheric concentrations. And fossil fuel emissions is part of that, but also, for instance, agriculture, forestry, and all the natural processes. So we need to make sure we monitor this as a whole using all the observations we can put our hands on. So where are we now in doing this? Well, the most recent generation of satellite instruments, for instance, and within Copernicus we have the Sentinel satellite missions, and this is an example of the Sentinel-5 precursor mission on the right, observing nitrogen dioxide, which is co-emitted with CO2, for instance. So you can really see these plumes from city areas or from industrial areas that we can now observe by satellite. So this is information that we can actually use. On the left, there's an example of what we've been working with so far. So this is national reported emissions. Each country is obliged to keep detailed statistics of all the emissions that take place in a country, but this has to be reported only on a national scale and on an annual scale. So there's a lot less to see there, although it's very accurate information. So can we combine these things? Can we make sure we take the best of both to better monitor what we're doing with the atmosphere? There's a few challenges that we have to address to do this. So for instance, we look at CO2 concentrations by satellite, and this is an example from the CO2 monitoring satellite that's currently being built by the European Space Agencies, ESA and EUMETSAT, to monitor CO2 concentrations. And you can simulated example on the left here. How do we then transfer this? How do we translate this information into what we actually want, which is the emissions? And you can see an example on the right. Satellites do not measure emissions directly. They measure the atmospheric concentrations. And also satellites see only the total impact of both anthropogenic and natural effects. What I already said earlier, the emissions are embedded in a much more complex carbon cycle system. So what we do to solve this problem is that we bring in Earth system models. So these are computer models of the Earth atmosphere, but also including the land and the marine environment, that we can use then to translate the information we get from the observations into what we actually want to know, what we want to monitor. So this is quite complex, and I'm not going to go into detail, but this is the basic idea behind what we do in the Copernicus program, and especially within the Copernicus Atmosphere Monitoring Service. So where are we now with that? This is just one example for methane, and here we are working together, for instance, with the UN Environment Programme, which have launched their International Methane Emissions Observatory a few years ago. So this is a global international effort to see how we can monitor methane emissions. And on the illustration on the left, you can see that we can go from global scale, where we monitor large scale differences or variations, but then also zoom in to specific energy plants that are, for instance, leaking methane. So combining a different set of satellites with different capabilities, we can either get a global picture or zoom in on specific things. So this is where we are already at the moment. And again, Copernicus is already supporting this and contributing to these global efforts. For CO2, it's not as good yet, but there we are working towards this goal. If I talk a little bit more about how we monitor the impact of different ecosystems, which is also sort of the topic of this webinar, then it's really important to also take into account the emissions and the uptake by agriculture, forestry, and other land use. This is called the FOLU sector. And here we really want to observe the land surface especially. And there's different satellite missions over the years that have already been providing information on this. The amount of biomass, for instance, in a certain region, the land cover, land type, the impact of fires, even canopy structure. So this is a whole range of Earth observation data that's there to be exploited and to look at trends, for instance, how are we changing the emissions from and the uptake from this important sector over the years. And just as an example, and this comes from an effort by an international collaboration between space agencies, G.A.C, that have been looking already at how can we use satellite data to monitor the FOLU sector. So these are just changes over a certain period of time in forests on the top and cropland on the bottom. So this is something we can already monitor and that we can use to better explain what we see in terms of atmospheric concentrations. So what are we doing then within Copernicus? So we are developing a new part of our Copernicus Atmosphere Monitoring Service portfolio, which is dedicated to monitoring greenhouse gas emissions, both from fossil fuel, but also from other anthropogenic activities. And the whole idea is to bring information together from satellites, from ground-based data, from the data we get from countries that they already report on their national and annual scale, bring that all together with the Earth system models, and then find a common solution of what we think is the best estimate of these different emissions at any time and any point on the globe. This is done on a global scale, but also on a very local scale, as I showed in the methane example. In the methane example, to have a global picture, but also be able to zoom in, and in the end to support governments and policymakers, the scientific community, the general public. So we have a whole different range of users in mind as we are developing and implementing this, and starting from what already existed and then improve on that as we go along. And here again, an example of how this works. How do we bring information together? This is an example where we used estimates of net fluxes, so the net exchange between the land surface and the atmosphere of CO2 for large countries or large areas in the world over time from 1980 till 2021, both based on ground-based data. People have been taking flask measurements where you take a sample of air and you measure the CO2 concentrations for several decades already around the world. So this is in blue, but also now from satellite data in orange, where we have this estimate of what of the exchange between the land and the atmosphere. And then in green, if it's visible for you, the national reported emissions for this particular sector, the FOLU sector. In order to do this, we had to use the ground-based observations, the satellite observations. We needed a computer model of the transport of the atmosphere to relate these observations to the emissions, but then also correct for different fluxes into and out of a country. For instance, carbon taken into a country or taken out out of country through economic processes. And also, for instance, things coming in and out through rivers, etc. So there's all kinds of different things that are brought in to come up with this final estimate. So where are we now? We are sort of halfway between when the Commission decided to start this whole process of building this new element of the Copernicus services already in 2015 around the Paris Agreement. We want to be fully operational in 2026, so there's still a few more years to go, but as we go along, we start providing more and more data sets and services already to general community, to the science community, to policymakers, especially also to see if this is what is required or if we still need to make adjustments. So it's a long process. We're not quite there yet, but there's hard work behind the scenes to make sure that we combine all the observations, satellite observations, old and new, with the Earth system models and the other information to provide policy relevant products to monitor these emissions, which is so important to make sure we stay on track. In summary, so the Copernicus Atmosphere Monitoring Service has already been providing consistent and quality controlled information in support of environmental policies and mitigation actions. So far, it has very much focused on air quality, but now we're also introducing greenhouse gas emissions as part of this. Also important to say here, CAMS data are not necessarily the end solution, but they can contribute, and they are contributing, to a wide range of downstream service and policy decision frameworks at local, national, and international scales. It's not the overall one thing fits all. It's the contribution by bringing in the different things I discussed towards better policy decision making. And then also to emphasize here that carbon monitoring using Earth observation data is rapidly evolving, with data and products becoming more mature every day. There's a lot of scientific activity going on, and we benefit from that, building that into these Copernicus operational services. So yes, we know it's maturing, but it's maturing very rapidly, which is for the good of us all. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Richard, for this very interesting presentation. We now open the floor to the audience for your questions. I remind you that you can share your questions on Slido or on the chat. Also, if you want to talk directly to Richard, you may raise your hand to ask your question. As we give some time to the audience to post their questions, I actually have one. You mentioned in one of the last slides that the target date to start having services and so on, it's the 2026. I was wondering if you're already collaborating with potential users to have a better understanding of their needs.
Yes, we definitely do. We are, for instance, working with national inventory agencies in especially European countries. They are responsible for reporting to UNFCCC. So we are discussing with them, well, how can we help you? How can we support you? How can we use Earth observation to make your estimates or your uncertainty estimates better? So there's one area. We are also have this week actually a workshop with representatives from cities around the globe to hear their feedback. What is it they actually require? What are their problems? And how can we hopefully help to strengthen their monitoring activities?
And in line with that, given that many regulations that go towards mitigating the effects of climate change, they don't just pose restrictions to countries and cities, but also to private companies. Could private companies actually profit from your services to monitor their emissions, or is that too localized?
For CO2, we have to see, because currently we don't have the satellite observations that we would need for that, but with the CO2 monitoring mission that's being built as part of the Copernicus program, we hope to make very significant improvements on that. So then we can see how far we can go. We definitely think we can zoom in on cities and large industrial areas, but then the detail we have to see. For methane, that's already clearer how far we can go, and especially also with now all these new small satellites that can zoom in, so that can be very specific. And here, for instance, I mentioned EMEO, and they are already working in a way that they are providing the information they generate with actually the companies that own these facilities to make them aware, to help them monitor what's going on. So that's really the thinking behind this.
And we also following up on this, we have a question from the audience indicating that you mentioned that methane products available are available even at local scale, and that they're asking if you could specify their spatial resolution.
Well, the satellite products within Copernicus have the current resolution of around 5. For methane, I think it's 5 by 7 kilometers. With the upcoming CO2 emission, we go into even higher detail. The methane satellites, most of them commercial, but some of them are also publicly funded, that are now being developed and launched. They can go to very high resolution, kilometer scale, or sometimes even less than that. There's also a lot of interest now in, for instance, Sentinel-2, which looks at the land surface at very high resolution, and that can also be used to look at methane emissions. So the resolution is increasing more and more. There's always a little bit of a trade-off between being able to monitor globally, so every place on the Earth, and zooming in. So that's why this combination of satellites that can look at global scale and at least detect the main emission sources, and then combine that with satellite instruments that can actually zoom in and look more specifically at certain areas.
And I was wondering, since the service is obviously useful at a global scale, and in fact some of the data that you showed was actually not from the EU. I was wondering if you have any collaborations already in place with partners from other regions of the world to expand the services that are provided.
Yes, we do. There's actually quite a bit of global collaboration. So we have been working already together with partners from the United States, from Canada, from Japan, etc. There's also more and more global coordination. I mentioned already the Committee of Earth Observation Satellites, CEOS, which is collaboration between the space agencies. EMEO from UNEP is a collaboration, but now also within the World Meteorological Organization, WMO. Their Congress, which is members from all their member states, is meeting this week and approving a new collaboration framework to monitor greenhouse gas concentrations and emissions. So really trying to work together on an international scale.
That's great to know. I think there are no, I don't see any more questions from the audience. So I want to thank you again for your very interesting presentation and for answering all of our questions. Thank you very much for being here with us today. And
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. Before we move on to our next presentation of the day, I would like to pose another question for you on Slido. And we're curious to know if this is the first Copernicus webinar that you attend. Now, as you reply, I would like to introduce our next speaker, Marc Pattinson. He's a director of the consultancy group G.A.C. Group in Sophia Antipolis in France, which specializes in supporting public and private entities access European funding mechanisms, just such as Horizon Europe. He studied in the UK at the London School of Economics, where he obtained a master's in economics. He's currently coordinating the EC funding Protect project that is assisting the Earth observation community to position themselves for a climate change, climate mitigation, pre-commercial procurement EC funding call to be launched in 2024. He is also part of the Policy Learning Platform team, responsible for supporting Interreg Europe project partnerships in the fields of innovation and research. He's also recently co-authored a policy brief on the theme of innovative public procurement. Marc, the floor is yours.
Put it better, Sophia. Thank you very much for the invitation, and thanks for joining today. My presentation will be a bit different from Richard's one, but hopefully interesting. So let's try the screen sharing exercise. Let's see. Right, can you see everything, Sophia? Is that good?
Yes, we can see everything. Perfect.
So, this afternoon, I'm going to tell you a bit about the Protect project, which, as you can see from the title, is about supporting the procurement of innovative climate change services. Europe funds a lot of different type of projects. So this one is very much about enabling the Earth observation, the space community, the policymakers to access future funding. So I'll tell you a bit about that. And then today I'm going to focus more particularly about the opportunities for Earth observation climate service providers. And I could have chosen all the public stakeholders, but today I thought I'd focus more on the SMEs and business opportunities. So, as I said, we are part of the Horizon Europe program. My company G.A.C, we're the ones based down here in the south of France, at Sophie-Antipolis, which is a science park, and we have a sort of a cross-section of specialists that are both experts in procurement, for example, Corvers. We have climate, knowledgeable people with climate change. If I take one example, the Climate KIC, Climate Alliance. We have access to European networks and partners such as Urada, businesses, for example, through Aerospace Valley, a cluster based in Toulouse and Bordeaux in the Occitanie region. And it's unusual in the sense it's quite a short project. We have 24 months, but you'll understand why it's a short program, because it's meant to be the facilitation arm of a call that will be launched early 24 on pre-commercial procurement. So as I said, we're focused on the themes of climate change and climate. And we're approaching the project three perspectives. One, procurement community, those who traditionally are involved in buying services, either from public agencies or private suppliers. We're looking at the service providers, the Earth observation community, and we're also looking at the broader policy makers who perhaps have challenges, who have climate change related issues that are on either their strategic priorities, the main missions they have to deliver. And so the three communities are at the heart of our interactions in Protect. I'll come on to what I say here in the second paragraph, is that Protect is about building a capacity building. It's a good way to look at it, helping the Earth observation community in its widest sense prepare for this PCP call that we launched early 24 with 90 million. I think, Sophia, you said at the beginning, not only do you have the recording of this event, but you'll have the slides, so you'll be able to follow the links. This call is obviously in draft, but sufficient information is available for those who want to follow this link. And in trying to identify the first steps of the potential challenges that are linked to climate change, 5 let's say thematic areas were identified. You see them on the slide here. The marine and coastal environments, energy and utilities, let's call them smart cities, the urban communities, the agriculture, forestry and land use issues, and the civil security and protection domain. And we could have added others, but we think these are 5 domains that enable the different actors that we work for and with, whether it's the climate change policymaker, whether it's the service provider, to try and share with us the potential cooperation that could be part of the response to the PCP that will be launched within Horizon Europe early next year. So the work that we've undertaken has tried to structure the community, the climate change community, the Earth observation community, around these 5 domains. Activities that we've undertaken quite varied. Again, the CA is about helping the broader community get ready, and capacity building actions are quite important. If I just perhaps focus on one or two of these 6 specific objectives. The number 4, awareness raising. So this is about finding and the sort of information that may be missing from some people's capacity for knowledge about the Earth observation data, standards, certification, so quite technical support. And I think that you've seen from Richard's presentation, the type of data and access to services that can be made available through Copernicus. And if we look at the last one, the peer-to-peer exchange, we are trying to bring together a community of procurement, purchasers and buyers, to let them exchange on their own best practices and approaches, and maybe develop a group of people that would be willing to launch and participate in joint PCP. Because at the end of the day, this PCP is about not only procuring innovative services, but procuring them in a cross-border or interregional dimension. So it's quite important that the project that Protect brings these people together in different activities to ensure that they may be interested in forming a consortium to respond to the call next year. I previously mentioned the stakeholders that we're working with. Left-hand side, you see the procurement community from the 7 states. Not just the public, but also some organizations, large, supranational organizations also have procurement teams. In the middle, and this is the focus of the later slide, looking at this Earth observation community, SME startups. It's the community we find in some of the big European networks, whether that's G.A.C, whether it's the clusters, the European Aerospace Cluster organization, the individual clusters such as Aerospace Valley, and then the actors. And we're sharing today with one of the actors in here, and other partners and people who organize events. For example, we'll be at the ERSC annual event in a couple of weeks, and using those networks and resources to access both the climate service providers and also link to the public procurement community. Those are the key people who are attending our workshops, who are participating in our events, and who are inviting us to share and work through their own, let's say, annual general meetings or final events. We've attended some EU final event and project events to share the opportunities of, let's say, Protect. In the more specific sense, the terms innovation procurement are being shared. We know that the PCP, the pre-commercial procurement, is quite new. It's not as embedded in the legislative frameworks of most countries, and we've recently produced a report that looks on how PCP legislation is embedded in the national legislation of our EU 27. That will be available on the Protect website once the Commission has approved it. But this bundle of looking at, how does innovation procurement work? And we know in each country there are national legislation constraints and European on top. There are other partnerships. Earlier this week, I was in Holland working with a DG Grow supported public procurement innovation partnership. So we're trying to connect those innovation procurement communities. The Earth observation data, whether it's space-based data that's being provided, in situ observation, or even citizens observation. And I think Richard explained how, satellite data is one source, ground data sources are others. So looking at how different climate service providers can engage with the responses for the climate action agenda. And this is where we will hopefully create a critical mass of interest for replying to the PCP. Some of the activities, as you see, we're not enrolled, and when you'll get this slide, you'll see there are different surveys that you can connect to. Now, these aren't surveys asking you for your name and address and if you want to receive newsletters. These are very engaging you in the community to put you into the workshops that are capacity building. So if I just take the example in the middle here on the Earth observation, the output of this survey here is to provide a showcase, a catalogue of climate service providers that can then be shared with the procurement community, with the policymakers that may be looking for particular solutions, that this community of SMEs, and you can see we've already got quite a big bundle that appears on our catalogue that will also be published on the Protect website. We attend conferences, and as I said, the Protect community of public authorities and procurers, almost 70 people part of this group. So by joining these little links, you can participate quickly, and in this case, on the providers, showcase your company, its technologies, participate in the e-pitching events that will take place in the autumn, and joining here, you can find like-minded public procurement and policy actors who may be sharing the same climate change challenges. Some of the initial work that has been undertaken highlighted some of early themes could be part of future shorter. In the first one, if we look at the focus has been on thermal monitoring and predicting waste fires, monitoring the hazardous wastes, illegal dumping. So, partners have said, well, how can we monitor, how can we observe the changing circumstances around these either regulated waste depots or legal depots? And so, the Earth observation data, whether it's temperature, humidity, etc., is one theme. Another one is looking more at the illegal dumping and the impact on waste and water, and the potential for sending alerts to the agencies, either enforcement for immediate actions or for follow-up and the criminal and judicial proceedings. This is, as you can see, these themes are one of the 5 in our focus of Protect. Try to select one from each one, so it's not a complete connection, but you get on the marine and coastal, no surprise of the flooding, the depiction, the prevention, operation benefits. On agriculture, looking at the issues of encroaching salinity and the impact on vegetation and growth, whether it's farming or even natural parks. Last but not least, looking at the issue for water, freshwater usage on farming, in part linked to the growing challenges of irrigation and drought in certain parts, certainly Southern Europe. So these are some of the ideas that have been posted by the procurement community or by the policymaker as a potential idea for gathering some commonalities with other public purchasing and policy making bodies. What's happening in the near future, and I think it's on here, said I talk mostly about innovation. See, there are a number of conferences that we attend. Example of the Expandio community, some e-pitching by climate service providers. We will be organizing what we call open market consultations with Earth observation providers in the autumn and the early parts of next year, but mostly this autumn. And the priority is at the later part of this year is working with the public buyers community to get some outline consortia for preparing and responding to the PCP call. So in joining and registering with the Protect community, you have access to these free services, whether it's training for your procurement experts who maybe have never dealt with a PCP, and sharing, let's say, your challenges and finding other regions, other organizations that may be wishing to share the costs of such development, and obviously Earth observation, climate service providers giving their knowledge and services to maybe respond to some of the challenges that are being identified. So how can you engage? Well, you know, there's a link here to the CP different forum, different elements.
We cannot hear you right now. Maybe if you get closer to the mic.
Okay, sorry. I haven't moved, but I'll speak a bit louder. The Earth observation companies survey, I think again under this icon here, catalog. The survey was designed by our partners from Aero Valley, and you can see already we've got a bundle of climate service services, and also individual companies and organizations. Companies can offer more than one. You see, if you look at the middle one, we've got 167 climate services, individual climate services coming from 115 companies. And so this is an important way in which you can share make your services visible, and we can then promote them through the different services, as I've mentioned, the e-pitching or simply the online catalog. So that's particularly relevant for the Earth observation companies. Overall, if you do try, and if you're either a climate service or an Earth observation company, share this information with your colleagues. If you're a facilitator, these are the sort of justifications for why we engage. So putting yourself in touch with potential buyers. PCP, as you know, is about helping your research and development. So this is point 2, to grow your market, to establish the market. It's also a way of funding your R&D activities. PCP is about funding 3 or 4 companies in finding a solution and then selecting that solution. Your, let's say, proximity to the end users in this process means it's more likely the services will be purchased. And by joining Protect, the partners are obviously better placed when in responding to the PCP, because you'll have insight, knowledge and partnerships, and perhaps a ready-made consortium. So there are strong arguments for those who are interested in engaging in PCP to join the Protect community and get some early advice and maybe partners for bidding. As I mentioned, the e-pitching sessions and open market consultations. So if you're registered on the platform, you can be invited, again, a way of showcasing your services to the procurement community, and you can perhaps already help. This is a two-way flow. Help procurement identify a means or a solution to a challenge that they haven't yet embarked upon. So quite an important opportunity for if you're going to be joining and develop new services through the PCP. Last but not least, I put the link here again. The PCP core going to be led by the public sector, cities, regions, national bodies, clearly working alongside climate service providers that to be partners in the project to access the money that can co-invest alongside their existing R&D activities to shape the potential service to make it more market ready, to make it progress across the technology readiness level, to enable it to be a service that can be purchased and say disseminated beyond the call partners, beyond the challenge identified in this particular call. So the links here, my email, tech website, follow us, but mostly I'd recommend do one of the surveys. If you're from the procurement and public policy, it's one way in, and if you're Earth observation, another way into the services that can be offered. I think that's it. So stop there. Sophia, I don't know.
Yes.
Any questions? I'm happy to share any other information.
Thank you very much, Marc, for your presentation. And indeed, now we open the floor to any questions that the audience may have. As before, you can share your questions on Slido or on the chat, or you can raise your hand. In the meantime, I have a few questions, actually. So on the one hand, in relation to your call to action to anyone interested in joining the project, and I'm sure that many participants may be interested. Is it only possible to participate if you're an EU-based stakeholder, or is it open to other countries?
Yeah, I saw in the chat the question from Sean McCarthy regarding UK and UK companies. I mean, nothing prevents UK companies participating in Protect. As I say, it's an open platform. The rules of engagement for Horizon Europe, there are experts with those. They might be in place by 24, co-funding arrangements. At present, I don't think they're there. But in terms of participating, connecting, we don't have any restrictions on who can join the Protect community. The detailed opportunity within the PCP call itself will be linked to the current Horizon Europe rules in early 2024. So today, partners from the UK can join and participate in our activities.
And also, since you were focusing mainly on SMEs, startups, and developers, I was wondering if you had any, or which have you found are the main challenges that startups, SMEs, and developers face when trying to benefit and exploit from EU-space data, such as Copernicus data, to tackle the different needs and challenges that you've identified?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, we're not going into the detailed problems of their business model and how they exploit data. What we're trying to work with is the interface between their potential service and the value it brings to a particular challenge. Take the example of illegal refuse. If it's simply monitoring from space and it's more of a mapping tool, looking at how do we pick out these elements, that's one thing. If it's looking at some of the risk factors, then it's more linked to the atmospheric conditions. It can be identification of early indication of fire or other leakages into the water, natural environment. So we're more looking at how to what extent the services are close to market. If it's a market service already, then PCPs can't work with it. It's not the right tool. So we're looking for emerging services that need some additional end user collaboration. We all know of the ability of whether it's the valley of death in terms of funding for first finding your clients, but the PCP can provide that gap funding and support to either finish the R&D or innovation to make it better suited to the needs of our clients. And we saw that during the COVID period, where some rapidly progressed innovation for in the healthcare, robots to disinfect parts of a hospital. And suddenly their visibility by working with one health provider meant they suddenly had a European market because they had one user that bought quickly. And so the PCP process is about helping SMEs finalize their technology and service offer, and then hopefully having it purchased because it's aligned with the need that the public procurement and policy maker has identified. And then that is catapulted into a much wider sphere. So we're not going into the details of how they sort out the technology, the problems of utilizing the data from satellite or other forms of Earth observation. We're more looking at the product end and the service delivery, making it relevant. But there will certainly be technical problems, and the R&D PCP can help fund it, but we're not at this stage of we're a CSA, so we're much more about facilitating the connections and the linkages between these type of actors.
And can projects at any stage of development join, or is it for mid to high TRL?
Yeah, it's not TRLs 1, 2, and 3. I think we're more looking at the 4 to 6 and getting it, to 8 but not 9. So I think it's that leveling. It's 7 to 8, and making it could simply be sort of adapting an existing service to a new market opportunity, which is linked to one of the challenges that a procurement partner will have identified, or it could be, well, we're at a TRL 4 and 5 and we think we can get to 7 or 8 with this PCP. So yeah, it's in that middle area.
Yeah, basically targeting the most complex part of going from the development of, or the research side to actually having something that can be commercialized and sold. Okay, that's very interesting. I see that we have a question on the chat. I read it for everyone. Is the community of climate services providers you're trying to gather only focus on commercial organizations or also Earth observation open data solution providers?
Yes, I mean, we're not, our job isn't to try and increase the turnover of a commercial business. It's about finding a solution to a climate change or a climate mitigation action. So if that can come from an open data source, organization, then I won't encourage you, and rather the opposite, to put you into this community. So from that perspective, we don't have any barriers. If the PCP is about funding the development or the final stages of development. So if it's through an open source or others, for us there isn't a barrier. So you're more than welcome to participate and join the Protect party.
I don't see any other questions from the audience, so to avoid going over time, I want to thank you once again for your very interesting presentation and also for answering all of our questions today.
Pleasure.
Thank you for joining us. And we are reaching the end of this 10th Copernicus webinar. I want to thank again our speakers for such interesting and engaging presentations. And thank you, the audience, for your participation and engagement. We hope that you learned something new today about how Copernicus can be an asset for carbon and ecosystem accounting. Now, before you leave, we would love to have some feedback from you. We will appreciate it if you could answer one final question on Slido, which is how useful have you found the content of this webinar? Also, if you have any other questions or comments, you can reach us through our online channels, which I invite you to follow in case you aren't already doing so, to stay tuned on Copernicus. So thanks again for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you on our next webinar. Have a nice day. See you next time.
Thank you. Bye.